Now, this is the drill. The candidates know this, but I just want to make sure everybody else does. Each group will be first invited to make 60-second opening statements. We'll then move to a discussion of 3 core areas: COVID recovery, anti-Semitism, and education. For each of the issue areas, I will give one set of framing. I'm not going to do it each time we ask the candidate something. And each candidate will have up to 90 seconds to respond. Following the initial responses, if I see or hear an attack or something that requires somebody to be able to respond, I have some discretion to do that. I won't use that unless it's obvious that we need to. The candidates, because I don't know how you actually answer all these questions in 90 seconds, but these are the rules of trying to do all of this in an hour. The candidates will receive a notification in the chat box. They have 10 seconds remaining, and then another notification when time has expired. We will have to figure out. We will end up probably muting a couple of seconds afterwards so that we can give people the opportunity. We'll have at the end of these three rounds a lightning round where the candidates will have just basically 10 seconds to answer a variety of questions. Yes, I know that's completely unfair, but this way we can just get another few areas in there, including my favorite question, which hopefully I will be able to ask before the candidates give their closing statements. And those closing statements are about 60 seconds each. So before we dive in, I want to thank, and that's our dog, but who wants to be engaged in this. But before we dive in, I want to just say to our New York Jewish Agenda community, we try to incorporate all your questions into the framing of the core issues as well as the lightning issues. Obviously, we did not do enough to Bella's satisfaction. So, number one, initially, and what we're going to do is we're going to start in this order for the opening statements. Ms. Morales, Mr. Stringer, Mr. Yang, Mr. McGuire, and Ms. Sutton. So, we've told you who we are. We love to hear about you. What prompted you to run for mayor? What would be your top priority as mayor of New York City in your first term? And how would you accomplish it? Ms. Morales.
Thank you so much, Randy. It's such a pleasure to be here with everybody. I really appreciate having the opportunity to have this conversation. So my name is Dianne Morales. I am a first generation Black Boricua born and raised in Bed-Stuy. I'm also the proud single mother of 2 young adults. I've had over 25 years experience in meeting the needs of New Yorkers when our systems have failed. I also grew up here. I taught here in the public schools. I raised my family here, and I'm an organizer right here in this city. My experiences have exposed me to many of our failed systems, but they've also exposed me to the hope of our communities. And it was that combination that led me to enter this race. The next mayor has to have a clear vision in defending and protecting human rights. That includes the rights of all New Yorkers, those who have been made increasingly vulnerable over the course of the last 4 years and in this crisis. We all benefit from doing that, from recognizing our collective interdependence and orienting our policies towards everyone's ability to live safely, in dignity, and provide for their families. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Mr. Stringer.
Good to see you, Randy, and thanks for giving me this opportunity. It's great to be here with you. Look, I don't have to tell anyone on the Zoom today, we're facing a public health crisis, we're facing an economic crisis, and a social justice crisis. And this crisis is not like the Great Recession. It's not even after the tragedy of 9/11. It's not even about the city's fiscal crisis back in the 70s. This is akin to the Great Depression, bread lines, food lines, hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs, the whole hope of people's families just wiped out because of this virus. And the most important job of the next mayor will be able to tackle the inequities laid bare by this pandemic. And I'm someone who grew up in the city. I like to think I've seen a lot of the challenges facing New York. I grew up in Washington Heights and Inwood, not far away from Randy. And I believe strongly we cannot reopen this economy the same way we closed it. And I want to use my experience in government and my vision to bring the city back, to open the economy, not the same way we closed it, but to make sure we have an inclusive economy and a strategy to bring back every single community. This is what motivates me to run. I believe that the next mayor has an opportunity, not just to rearrange the deck chairs, but to bring fundamental change to the city from an economic perspective, health perspective, and definitely a social justice perspective.
Thank you. Mr. Yang.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Nija. I'm thrilled to be here. You asked us to introduce ourselves. I feel like most people got to know me during the presidential campaign. But I moved to New York City as a law student when I was 21 years old. I worked in small businesses and technology companies for over a decade and became the CEO of an education company that grew to become #1 in the US. And that's the way I'm wired. I'm wired as an operator who wants things to work better. And I'm going to suggest that that's where most New Yorkers are right now. We can see that our systems and bureaucracies are not functioning at a high enough level. Even this vaccination rollout, which is key to our recovery, has had real problems. My #1 goal is to be the comeback mayor. We need to accelerate our recovery because the truth is, New York City may not recover in the form we want it to unless we have the right leadership that can activate resources both within city government and in the private sector and in philanthropy and in the nonprofit sector. We need all hands on deck. I believe I can speed up our recovery, and that is why I'm running to be your mayor.
Thank you. Mr. McGuire.
Thank you, Randy. Listen, I'm Ray McGuire, and I come from the other side of the tracks, raised by my single mother. I didn't know my dad. I came to New York, and New York has given me everything. It's where my wife and I are raising our 3 children. I love this city. But today, as you said from the outset, this city is broke, it's broken and divided. If I take my lived experiences in the streets, and I take 40 years of proven leadership experience in business where I've created jobs and given opportunity, I have a vision for this city that is rested on 3 pillars. It's the economy, where I've outlined my plan to create 500,000 jobs. Go big, create fixed and infrastructure. Go small, to give a lifeline to small businesses, and go forward to make certain that I lead the largest, most inclusive economic comeback in the history of New York City. #2, it is safety and justice, to repair what is inequities in the racial and religious injustices that occur almost every day. And #3 is focusing on educational system, where we need to give education and opportunity to all the same way that I had. I want to make sure that every zip code in this city and every child has the opportunity to have a great education. That's why I'm running for the mayor of New York City.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. And Ms. Sutton.
Hi, good to be with you, Randy. Thanks so much for the invitation. My name's Loree Sutton, and I am running for mayor to bring sanity, leadership, common sense to a city I love. I didn't start here. I got here as soon as I could after 30 years of serving in the Army as a psychiatrist, a public health doc, a White House fellow, a university professor, and a combat vet. I know what it is to lead large, complex organizations. When I had the opportunity just a few years ago, my wife Loree and I came to New York City. I was fortunate to be appointed as commissioner of what was then the mayor's office for Veterans Affairs. A year later, we were doing what the city has not done in the last 15 years, standing up a new municipal agency dedicated to veterans and their families. But while I was doing this, I looked around and I saw the city going in all the wrong ways. I looked for where is the leadership going to come from that can lift up and lead forward all New Yorkers. I didn't see it. That was before the pandemic. Now, with all that lies before the next mayor, public safety has to come first, opening up the city for business and investing in public health so that we never close this way again. That's it for now. I look forward to your questions. Ask me anything.
Thank you so much. So this is the first area that look, there's tons of things that we would love to talk to you about, but obviously COVID recovery. So New York City has always been a place of great opportunity and great inequality. And COVID has laid bare those deep inequities in our city. And you see it in virtually every aspect of city life, as many of you have said in your opening, from transportation access to land use, to housing, to wages, to and the rest of the economy, to education, to healthcare. And so in our Jewish tradition, we instruct tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice, you shall pursue. And as a Jewish community motivated by this value of justice, obviously we care deeply about ensuring that the path to recovery in the aftermath is just and is equitable. And frankly, we know that kind of focus that we have to have in terms of all communities of color. But what is probably surprising is that COVID-19 has impacted segments of the Jewish community particularly hard. The Orthodox Jewish community has been particularly hard hit, suffering a tragic loss of life, the disruption of their traditional practices, and the spread of dangerous misinformation about the virus. So the question is both, a general question about how will you ensure that policy driving New York City's COVID recovery is just and equitable, protecting the most vulnerable New Yorkers and ensuring economic growth for all. And second, how do you repair the breach of trust that has happened, particularly between the Orthodox Jewish community and City Hall? And again, I know these are impossible in 90 seconds, but let's start this time with Mr. Stringer, and then I'll go to Mr. Yang, Mr. McGuire, then Ms. Sutton, and Ms. Morales.
At the height of the COVID crisis, I lost my mom to the virus, and she was taken to the hospital, and I was never to see her again. And my family did not have closure. But one of the most important conversations I had the night she died was with her doctor. She died at a Bronx hospital. And the doctor said to me that this virus is a virus that discriminates. It goes to the most vulnerable. And the doctor talked about the pain and the loss of tremendous life in Black and brown communities, people coming into the Bronx hospital, dying in their 50s and their 40s. And he knew I was going to run for mayor that night. And he said, you've got to watch this and change this. And of course, he was right. The truth is that the health disparities that COVID exposed have got to be fixed. This government has spent too much time managing people's illnesses, not solving them. The truth is, when you come to the big ticket items like land use and zoning, where did all the bus depot stations go and the peaker plants? Well, they went to our boroughs and they went to communities of color. And the hit resulted in the real discrimination. We need a mayor, not with training wheels, but who has real expertise in bringing this government back and bringing the city back. And the way to do that is to open the recovery differently, to invest in communities hit hardest by the virus, to make sure that when looking at community-based planning, we're listening to communities, whether it's the Orthodox community or the Latino community in the Bronx. And my work, both as a member of the Assembly, as a borough president who understands community-based planning through land use and zoning, my work as the chief fiscal officer in the city, I know that on day one, I can build a government that's going to lift up New Yorkers who have been hardest hit, create pipelines to careers for people who need job training and retraining. We need a workforce development plan that's going to mean the difference in our neighborhoods. And we have to finally create one justice system for the city, one way of governing that includes so many people, not just the 1%, but everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. Mr. Yang.
Thank you, Randy. It's such an important question, and we can see it playing out again with the vaccine. So if you look at the vaccination process, it's the kind of task that if you have an equitable plan, it's going to have vastly inequitable impact. What do I mean by that? If you set up vaccination sites and information, and we all know the information has not been presented well, there are somewhere between 3 and 9 websites that you have to navigate. But communities of color, people with lower levels of resources will have less time, less opportunity, often less proximity, they're not going to be able to get vaccinated at the same levels. So what the city should have done is the city should have adopted different levels of eligibility based upon neighborhoods and the demographics of the community. You could have gone to a predominantly Black neighborhood like Brownsville and said, look, here the eligibility is going to be age 45 so that we can make sure that people can get vaccinated quickly and efficiently. And the fact is the Black communities are at higher risk for COVID, so that would have been wholly appropriate from a public health perspective. If you have an even process and very, very uneven access and resources, then the impact will be uneven. When you talk about the Orthodox Jewish community, there has been a real erosion of trust, and it's been disastrous. I've been in touch with various leaders of the Jewish community, and they say that that's been the dynamic. What we have to do is we have to get on the same page about what the goals are, whether it's preserving public health or trying to make sure that our children have a quality education, and then come together. I will say that I tend to defer to the people who are closest to the ground, who are doing the work. I do not think it should be for government to be making proclamations from a boardroom when there are hundreds of educators who are doing the work every single day.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Mr. McGuire.
Sure. Thank you for this all-important question. We knew the situation existed long before COVID. So what do we need to do? In the short term, we need to make certain that every New Yorker is vaccinated quickly and equitably. We need to make certain that they're connected to primary care facilities that are both culturally and linguistically sensitive and aware in their neighborhoods. And then we need to make certain they got a relationship with a healthcare provider that lasts beyond the pandemic, because there's situations that are now developing lingering impact of COVID that we need to address, and we need to be prepared for how we address that. Today, we're not prepared for that. Longer term, I'll create a comprehensive plan to expand the clinics and the quality urgent care systems in the underserved communities. Today, we don't have that. Many of these communities, we have healthcare deserts, and we need to address that. We also need to make certain that we begin today to jumpstart the economy, which is why I focus so much on the economy and my plan to make certain that we have the largest and most inclusive economic recovery that exists anywhere in this country in the history of this great city. We need to make certain that I have my comeback plan and my job accelerator plan to focus on the small businesses. And as we begin to go into the communities, as we begin to focus on what's taking place with the small businesses, as we get our economy back to working, we should simultaneously make certain that the conditions that existed pre-COVID are the conditions that we address today. In conversations with the leaders in the Jewish community, we've gone through and highlighted why these inequities occurred, how they've occurred, and why it is that they persist, notwithstanding all of the platitudes that have been given by people who've been in office for a long time. The sense of urgency has to be now, and we have to address it today with all deliberate speed and with all available resources.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. Ms. Sutton.
Thank you so much, Randy. You know, so much of this comes down to relationships. When we look at, as you mentioned, the vaccine discrepancies, the issues that became so apparent earlier in the pandemic, they came as some surprise to folks on cable news and talking heads, but not to the people who are living in brown and Black communities and impoverished communities around our city. We must, at this point, in fact, I think we could take a trip to Israel and take some notes and lessons and learn how they have been able to so really and effectively disseminate their vaccine program. And we must now, it's not too late. Let's deploy, let's go on a block by block basis to the parts of our city where folks don't have access to transportation. They don't have access to the resources that would allow them to easily access the vaccine. And perhaps the most difficult issue of all is the trust issue. So the next mayor has to work closely with community leaders, both in the faith communities, as well as the business and the schools and the parents and the teachers. All of us are in this together. And we must ensure that what we have seen over this next year never happens again. And I'll just close this response with Brian Dories and his work with Theater of War Productions. I would urge for any of you, one of the most pressing, poignant experiences I've had was recently, about a year ago, at the Jewish Heritage Museum, the investigation, bringing communities together to have those hard, tough conversations that create trust. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Morales.
Thanks again. So two critical things I want to start off with in responding to this question. One is that 15% of Jewish New Yorkers are actually also people of color. The Jewish community is not a monolith, and I think that's an important point to acknowledge here. And in so far as the trust is concerned and the issue with the Orthodox community, I think we have to be real. At the midst of all of this, we had Trump. And we had people on the national level who were engaging in fear mongering and reducing the emphasis around the severity of COVID-19. And so we have to recognize that part of repairing the harm and the mistrust that has arisen as a result of all of this is also going to require us to find local community-based organizations that help to rebuild those relationships. And part of that is, and that is part of why I have called for the implementation of, in my administration, a New York City 5000, which would be a COVID-19 equity and data response unit that would review, assess, and address the ongoing disparities throughout the city, especially in regard to race, gender, and sexual orientation, would rely on the creation and the establishment of relationships with trusted, credible messengers that are reflective, both linguistically and culturally, of the communities that they are serving, and would focus on working through faith-based and other community-based institutions that are trusted in order to do outreach to the community, and provide education and increase access to the services that are needed.
Thank you so much. And my apologies sometimes for looking down. We have a thread with all the people who have helped put this together. And I just want to make sure that I keep on time and on target. But you all raised, all the issues about, trust and communities. And that kind of leads us to the next question, the next area, which is, as you would imagine, the New York Jewish Agenda would be concerned about the topic of anti-Semitism. And as Matt shared in his introduction, the Jewish community, and I think Dianne Morales said this as well, it's not a political monolith. In fact, as the joke goes, if you talk to two Jews, you'll get three opinions. And perhaps nowhere is there more disagreement within the American Jewish community right now than how to best fight anti-Semitism. And while there's no disagreement about the rise of white nationalism, and that rise has led to a rise in racism, in anti-Semitic attacks, in Islamophobia, and in other forms of bigotry and hate, New York City is not immune from this worrying trend. The day after the January 6th attack and attempted coup on the US Capitol by the white nationalist groups, a Confederate flag was hung outside the New York Museum of Jewish Heritage. And just yesterday, swastikas were painted on the Rego Park Jewish Center in Queens. So essentially, again, unfair to do this in 90 seconds. What's your plan to combat this growing anti-Semitism in New York City? And frankly, which Jewish organizations and leaders would you turn to in that moment of crisis where you would get some of your guidance, and who could help in this moment? And let's start this time with Mr. McGuire, and then I'll go to Ms. Morales, Mr. Yang, Mr. Stringer, and Ms. Sutton.
Listen, it is essential that the mayor focus on this. Today, that's not the case for many in the Jewish community. Examples of this are the anti-Semitism has increased in New York, especially for the Orthodox community. Clothing and head coverings often make them most easily identifiable. You've looked at some of the statistics here. Increases in anti-Semitism that have gone up horrifically. The responsibility has to change. I'll push for a comprehensive anti-bias and anti-hate education, and I'll call injustices out every time that I see them. The Simcha congregation is a horrific event. We no longer talk about that event. My relationship with the Jewish community goes back from my childhood. It goes back to 40 years ago when I was fortunate to visit Israel and be in the middle of Jerusalem, King David and Ben Yehuda. The relationships that I've had and the conversations that I've had across the community are conversations that inform me of how important it is for us to have the open dialogue. But it's also important where we see anti-Semitism to call it out. It is reprehensible and there should be zero tolerance. And so under my leadership as mayor, I'll call it out and I'll make sure that it is something that we address, and we address it with a sense of urgency which it requires. It cannot stand in any community. It certainly cannot stand in our community. I find it reprehensible. I find it something that we need to address. I find that I have the relationship to make sure that I have the direct dialogue to let the Jewish community know that I stand with it. And this is not something which I have any tolerance.
Mr. McGuire, Ms. Morales.
Thank you for this really important question. So, I'll start off by saying that my intention is to be the mayor of all of New York City for all New Yorkers. And I believe that Jewish safety has to be based within solidarity. We're seeing an increase in anti-Asian attacks. We're seeing an increase in anti-Semitic attacks. We're seeing an increase in Muslim attacks, anti-Black attacks, all within the context of a real rise in white supremacy. I think that the way for us to keep people safe is to keep each other safe and to redefine and rebuild community safety within each other. There are, direct threats happening to all of us, and I am committed to protecting all of New Yorkers in fighting white supremacy. We've got, Proud Boys marching in our streets. I have deep ties with intersectional faith movements in organizations such as JFREG, and I'm always open to finding more moments and more opportunities to hear from folks and to learn from community leaders. I also have a history with both UJA and JCRC, and would be happy to have those conversations with those organizations as well. But the point is that we do this together and we keep each other safe.
Thank you. Mr. Yang.
Thank you, Randy. I'm just going to relate two brief stories. I was talking to a friend and colleague a number of years ago about his family, and he lost an entire side of his family in the Holocaust. Hate is on the rise, but anti-Semitism is its own form of evil, and we have to be incredibly vigilant because of its virulence, the deaths and it's caused over history. The second story I have is much more uplifting. I was talking to a Jewish leader who brought a Holocaust survivor to FDR High School to speak to a group of students. And it was supposed to be a small group of students, but it turns out that every student wanted to hear these Holocaust survivor stories. And it ended up being a 2-hour program with hundreds of students in an auditorium, and teachers canceled classes. And I thought that was like an incredible emblem of what we can do here in New York to help bring communities together. I think that NYPD should be proactive in terms of protecting other communities of faith. We can't wait for hatred and violence to actually occur. We have to dedicate resources to it preemptively. I'm friends with Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL, and he and I speak about this, about the vigilance we need. Because hatred, as Dianne said, is on the rise toward different communities, but anti-Semitism has a special place in human history as something we cannot allow to ever be accepted, normalized in any context.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Mr. Stringer.
Well, I have to tell you that when that Confederate flag was tied to the door of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, it hit home to me. My wife is executive vice president at the museum. And there's something about that kind of hatred that literally gets dropped at your door, the things you have to tell your children and you worry about your loved ones. But this is hate that is growing every year. It's fueled by white supremacy. And there's also a surge in anti-Asian violence. And what I love about this city and the work I've been able to do in government is when this city is under attack by white supremacy, whether there's an attack on the Jewish community or the Muslim community or any other neighborhood, the organized efforts that I've led and have shown up to always includes the great diversity of our religious community and our advocacy community. That, to me, is the secret of response, and the mayor has to lead in that. But we also have to do more to combat bigotry. And one of the things I'm doing is working with Assemblymember Neely Rosick to expand Holocaust education. We just supported her bill with a coalition. We need hate crime awareness programs. You'd find this really shocking, but 25% of young people think the Holocaust was a hoax. And the only way we can combat anti-Semitism is by education, education, education. We have some great thought leaders in the Jewish community, Rabbi Potasnik, Sharon Kleinbaum, so many people who not just show up to fight anti-Semitism, but fight hatred in general. And that's what a mayor has to lead on.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. And last, but certainly not least on this question, Loree Sutton.
Thank you, Randy. You know, in addition to what's been
You're muted.
You're muted, Loree. Sorry.
okay.
We won't take that out of your time.
Thank you so much. In addition to what has been said already, I think there's a critical role for culture and the arts. I mentioned before the play, The Investigation. Peter Weiss wrote that play about the Auschwitz Frankfurt trial back in the 60s. He wrote this play, and it's now being used as a tool to bring communities together. When I saw it at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, it was amazing to hear the Jewish individuals, family members, leaders, including a Holocaust survivor who was heading up the panel, interface, and at times getting a little tense with the African-American community that was there in the same audience, and how masterful this piece was in creating a safe space, creating room for dialogue and conversations, tough conversations that just wouldn't happen otherwise. And I've seen this time after time over the last 12 years with Brian Dories and his Theater of War Productions, and I would bring this fully to scale across our city. Ellen Greeley, who was my former chief of staff at Department of Veterans Services, she is my rabbi in all things having to do with the interfaith world, and I would continue to rely on her and so many others. My fervent conviction is that there's more that joins us than separates us. My last conversation with Mayor Dinkins, he told me, he says, if you become mayor, General, remember, don't wait. If a Crown Hill riots happens, get out there early. You have to intervene early and enforce and stand up for what's right. Bring us all together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so inspiring to hear from all of you and the thoughtfulness in terms of all of your responses, which leads me to the last area, because you can imagine I wouldn't be moderating a debate where I didn't talk about education. And so there's lots of different areas and aspects of education policy that are really of interest to the members of the New York Jewish Agenda. But two of them I'm going to focus on. One is the one that's a hot button right now. How do you increase diversity and reduce segregation in New York City's specialized high school system, as well as its gifted and talented programs? And secondly, as mayor, how would you ensure that every child receives what the New York State Constitution calls a sound basic education on secular topics, including not just the public schools, but including the yeshivas and the other religious schools? And you'll have 90 seconds, and I'll start with Mr. Yang.
Sorry, who are you starting with, Randy? Sorry about that.
Sorry, Andrew, I'm starting with you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. I think that we have put a little bit too much stock in these tests. I'm not someone who wants to get rid of the SHSAT, but I think that it should be supplemented with grades is obvious, interviews, child's background. Our specialized high schools should reflect our communities to a much, much higher degree than they do now. But we also shouldn't let ourselves be stuck in this zero-sum game. We have a school system of 1.1 million. We should open 2 new specialized high schools in each borough, in part so that children don't have to commute over an hour each way to get to school. Like, that's not good for their educations. And we should be applying similar principles at the middle school level. If you're a teacher, you know our kid best, you know what their needs are. You don't need a test to tell you that that kid has a spark. You don't need a test to tell you that the child might be special needs, like one of my sons. So we should be investing more in the autonomy and ability of teachers and administrators to deliver what our children need without having to, frankly, sit for some test that's one data point, but not an holistic sense of who our children are. In terms of, am I done before I even got to talk about yeshivas? This is terrible. This is the worst thing that's ever happened.
No, I think you should. I think you should be able to talk about yeshivas. I think that's important for this audience.
Yeah, sure thing. So when I looked at the yeshiva question, Randy, the first thing I wanted to see were what were the outcomes? What is the data? Like, I do not think we should be prescribing a curriculum unless the curriculum can be demonstrated to have improved impact on people's career trajectories and prospects afterwards. I mean, if a school is delivering the same outcomes, like, I do not think we should be prescribing rigid curricula. And I will also say that when I was in public school, we studied the Bible for a month, Bible as literature. If it was good enough for my public school, I do not see why we somehow are prioritizing secular over faith-based learning.
Thank you. And sorry to the timekeepers that I just.
I was very punctual on the other questions. I got a little bit of time. All right, thank you.
Mr. McGuire.
Yeah, education is what got me here from the other side of the track, so it is a critical issue. I think the specialized high schools is one element on which we should focus. I would teach, though, to the child. I would not teach to the test. I think we need to expand the criteria. That's 30-some-odd thousand children. We have 1 million+ students on whom we need to focus. We need to take the quality education to the children. Educational outcomes should not be dictated as they are today by zip codes. And so I would be for quality education and religious freedom when it comes to how we teach our kids. And I'd make certain that the curriculum was a comprehensive curriculum, and make certain that we ensure that in every geography we had quality education in whatever form it exists. But I'm for quality education, and but for education, I wouldn't be here.
Ms. McGuire. Ms. Sutton.
Yes, thank you. I agree, Ray. Without education, certainly I wouldn't be here either. And I grew up in the parochial tradition, the Seventh-day Adventist tradition of schools, and I believe firmly, I'm going to start with the yeshiva question. I think we can find a solution here. I think there's been some needless division and rancor, and I think that we can find some solution here where it respects the religious rights and beliefs and practices, and also respects the secular requirements. I know that we can. When it comes to the specialized high schools, I believe that the areas of the city, particularly in parts of Queens and in the Bronx that are really underserved, let's put more attention there. Let's build up several more high schools. Let's expand gifted and talented, but let's make sure that instead of a single standard that applies across the city, that we give more power to the teachers who are with those young children and who can see we've got gifted and talented kids all over the city, and they're our treasure. We must invest in them. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Morales.
Thank you. So I'll say this. I am the only educator in this race. I attended New York City public schools, a specialized high school, and I'll get back to that in a second. I taught in the New York City public schools, and both of my children are graduates of the New York City public schools. So I believe I have a unique perspective on this. As a graduate of a specialized high school, I will say, much to the chagrin of many of my classmates and other alums, that I do not believe that the SHSAT serves our children well. Ultimately, the purpose of education should be to prepare all of our students, no matter what school they go to, whether it's a yeshiva or not, to be able to be critical thinkers who are able to make meaning of the world around them and make informed decisions for themselves about the path that they choose to pursue in their lives. And so to the extent that a specialized high school does or does not contribute to that, or a yeshiva does or does not contribute to that, That is what I believe our schools, all of our schools, should be providing and equipping our students to do. And that is the commitment that I make as mayor of New York City to ensure is happening across every school. And so, I think that we need to really make sure that our schools are providing the kind of quality, exposure, and experience that gives our students the tools to navigate the world. And that's what I will say about my education response. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I can't help but smiling. And last, Scott Stringer.
Well, look, let's put it where it is. We have a serious segregation problem in our specialized schools, and the next mayor has to come in and make some very tough decisions. So I'm going to do everything I can to repeal Heck Calandra, to make sure that we end the Shizat. We replace the Shizat with a 7th grade statewide test that will allow more people of color, Black and brown students, to access our specialized high schools. I respectfully disagree with my friend Andrew Yang. I don't think the answer is to build more specialized high schools that won't allow Black and brown kids in the system. I think we have to create an integrated school system. And the way to do that is a number of ways. One, end geographic streams at the high school level. Again, the Shizat has to go. We also have to build NYC Under 3, which is my program for real childcare. 80% of brain development occurs between the ages of 0 to 3. I give Bill de Blasio tremendous credit for pre-K, but let's double down. Look, my kid at the age of 4 was tested for GNT at 4. That makes no sense to me. We also need a teacher residency plan that's going to give financial assistance to train our teachers. 40% of our teachers leave after 5 years. We've got to invest in the future. And I would say, as a parent right now in the public school system, I got a 3rd grader and a 2nd grader. The teachers are the future, but we also have to make sure there's one standard of education. And we right now are too often looking at a parent's wealth and a zip code problem. And we have to be bold and think about this. And I know that people will balk, but the mayor has to have the strength and the experience to come in and make sure we have a justice system in the school system.
Randy, can I just respond to that briefly?
You can. You got about 30 seconds, Andrew.
No, don't worry. It'll be very fast. I think Scott knows that it's possible to both expand capacity and also improve the representativeness and diversity in those schools. They are not mutually exclusive. You need to accomplish both. But I think most people would agree at this point that expanding capacity would be a good idea.
And Scott, you got 10 seconds.
Well, first you have to have the idea about integration, and you can't muddle through it. The truth is that if you create more schools that will cream the school system without putting in place integration plan, I think there's a real problem. I certainly respect what Andrew's trying to say, but look, as someone who's been involved in government in this city for a very long time, who's audited the Department of Education to see the paralyzing infrastructure there, we need a mayor who's going to come in, take a sledgehammer to the bureaucracy, and make those bold decisions. Stop testing 4-year-olds for GNT, end geographic streams, get rid of the Shizat, and start building an inclusive education system. And by the way, it's not just top down. Look what they're doing in District 15 in Brooklyn and on the Upper West Side of District 3. Collaboration with parents to make sure we have integrated schools. That's the exciting part.
There is no reason you cannot accomplish the goals of representativeness, integrating multiple data points that can include a test.
All right. Wait. I love this, but we are run out of time. So I can't let you guys do this. So my apologies, but this is part of why this is such an important question. So we have about 10 more minutes, and this is what I'd like to do in terms of the lightning round. It's really just a yes or no. What do you think in 10 seconds so I can get all 3 questions in? And this is unfair, but I'm going to do it this way. We're going to just do it in terms of alphabetical order. So Mr. McGuire, Ms. Morales, Mr. Stringer, Ms. Sutton, and Mr. Yang, in that order in terms of each of these. So keep your keep unmuted. And so this is the first question. Do you support the boycott, disinvestment, and Sanctions Movement. Mr. McGuire. Did we lose Mr. McGuire? We may have lost Mr. McGuire if we get
No,
Mr. McGuire.
I'm here.
Oh, good, good, good. Sorry. Do you support the BDS movement?
No.
Ms. Morales.
I support that we shouldn't create an environment that penalizes people's right to organize and protest.
Mr. Stringer.
No.
Ms. Sutton.
No.
Mr. Yang.
No.
The next question, which I think Ms. Morales actually anticipated, is do you oppose efforts to criminalize support for BDS, which many believe would be a clear violation of the First Amendment? So do you oppose efforts to criminalize support for BDS? And again, I'll start with Mr. McGuire.
I am not in favor of efforts that that violate the First Amendment.
And I'm sorry, I think I probably asked it awkwardly, but you got my question. Thank you, Mr. McGuire. Ms. Morales.
Yes, I oppose the criminalization of protesting. Yes.
Mr. Stringer.
Yes.
Ms. Sutton.
Yes.
And Mr. Yang.
We should not be criminalizing a political stance.
Okay, so this is my last question before closing, which is, what is your standard order at New York Jewish Deli? Starting with Mr. McGuire.
Ox, bagel, cream cheese.
Ms. Morales.
Everything bagel, lots of cream cheese, and lox.
Mr. Stringer.
Okay, don't tell my wife matzo ball soup and pastrami on rye, but please, this is off the record.
I just tweeted it. Ms. Sutton.
Everything in a schmear.
And Mr. Yang.
Toasted whole wheat bagel with either scallion cream cheese or lox cream cheese.
Thank you very much. You've gotten all of us to laugh, which is very necessary in this moment of COVID. So let's start with, and again, I want to say thank you to all of you. And we got about a minute each to do closing remarks. And I'll start with Loree Sutton.
Oh, thank you so much, Randy. This has been a delight to be together today. I would just say, you know, I'm so glad we focused on education as one of the focus areas today. I think as mayor, the moral responsibility, the sacred duty that it is to be responsible for over 1 million children. I think there's so much we can do to enrich schools across our city, to create pathways and resources for kids early on. You know, folks, you know, introduce them to the trades, to tech, to design, to the wealth of opportunities that are here in our city, to have the private sector come in, adopt a school, so many things, to continue the conversion of schools to community centers with year-round programming and culture and the arts. I am so excited about the opportunities that are just in front of us, and I know there's so much more that joins us, that divides us, and I look forward to leading our city forward. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Loree. Ray McGuire.
Thank you. On October the 15th, I called my 94-year-old mother and gracious with her. This Sunday, she'll be 95. And I said, Mama, I quit my job. And she said, boy, you have lost your mind. What happened? I thought you had a good job. I said, yes, Mama, I do. And I did. But I'm looking at a city that I love, and you know it's given me everything. I'm looking at the crisis which you're now facing. And if I take my lived experiences, the foundation which you gave me, and the education that you gave me, and all I've been able to accomplish in the most competitive field, at least one of the most competitive fields, and all the relationships I bring here. And I said, you know, I didn't get termed out. I'm not looking for a promotion. I quit my job. I don't owe anybody anything. We're now in the midst of a crisis where there's no plan B and there's no cavalry. We have kids whose lives are now at risk. They're at stake. We have a city that's amidst 3 crises at once. If anybody has the relationship, if anybody has the proven leadership and management skills, and anybody who understands the language of the streets to the suites to bring the city together and lead the greatest economic comeback in the history, inclusive economic comeback in the history of the city, then I do. So my vision is an economic comeback. Go big, go small, go forward. It is making certain that our city is safe and just. It's making certain that all of our children have the same opportunities in education I had. If there's anybody who's capable of doing just that in a time of the greatest need, then it's me, which is why I decided to run for mayor. I ask for your support at rayformayor.com. Now's a crisis, but now's the time to choose the right leadership that lets this city be on the right side of history. And I'm the person to do just that. So thank you for your support and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Ray. Mr. Yang.
Thanks, Randy. Thank you, Nija. Appreciate this opportunity a great deal. I showed up in New York City 25 years ago as a 21-year-old law student. I've had the kind of opportunities and career, both personally and professionally, that 21-year-old could only have dreamed of. This city has been a place where people come to have their potential and dreams actualized for years, for generations, and that is in jeopardy right now. I'm running for mayor because I believe I can accelerate New York City's recovery. We are coming apart, and I believe that the Jewish community in particular has an historic role to play in helping keep our city whole and strong. We need you. The city needs you in the most fundamental way possible. I've learned so much from members of your community. I owe you all so much. And that there is no guarantee that our city will come back. We need the right leadership. We need someone who can bring people together, who can work with people from every walk of life, every sector, does not think that the city government is going to have the solution to all of the problems. We're going to have to activate people in the private sector and philanthropy. And I know you're going to be with us every step of the way. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Andrew. Scott Stringer. Scott.
Yeah, I have to say, on a personal level, yeah, I have two little kids, and I had them relatively late in life, and look, I don't have any personal money in the bank, so I'm not going to be able to leave my kids a whole lot of money. But the one thing that I think about a lot is that the thing that I can leave them as mayor is truly the greatest city in the world, and that to me is worth fighting for. And it's not just my kids, it's your kids and grandkids. It's the kids who live in homeless shelters, who don't have remote learning devices. It's the kids who are in public housing, who don't have internet access. It's really about making sure that we provide an opportunity to make sure we protect all of our children. Running for mayor as a kid from Washington Heights, who remembers all too well when nobody wanted to invest in our community. This campaign is about using my 30 years of real experience to go to City Hall. I'll be ready on day one for all of these challenges. My mayoralty will not be a mayoralty on training wheels. It's going to be with a specific agenda for everybody. I hope you consider me.
Thank you, Scott. And Dianne Morales, our last closer in this first session.
Thanks so much, Randy, and thanks to all of the members of NIJA and everybody who's watching. I just want to acknowledge I'm not a career politician. And I'm not going to tell you that I know where the bodies are buried, because that would imply that I was aware that they were being buried in the first place. My candidacy is a grassroots, people-powered movement that is reflective of New Yorkers who are ready to transform the city and address our historical inequities. I've spent my life working in communities shoulder to shoulder with those who are seeking to live in dignity and provide for their families. I'm running for mayor because I am ready to tackle the root causes of our challenges, causes that are rooted in racism and white supremacy. We're living in unprecedented times that call for the radical reimagining of what is possible. And I am not afraid to challenge the status quo. Mine are bold and radically different approaches to respond to a radically different time. We're at a crossroads, and there's a moral imperative for us to have the political courage to commit to a new social contract. I'm not promising to get New York City back to normal. I'm promising to help us build a New York City that has never existed before. And I am hopeful that we can do that together. Thank you.
Well, look, on behalf of, and I see some of the candidates for our second hour coming on, so I just want to say, on behalf of New York Jewish Agenda and all of the leaders and members and participants in this really great organization who looks at equity and looks at justice, you have been, it's been remarkable. You're giving up your time like this. We are very grateful. And so I really want to say thank you to Ray McGuire, Dianne Morales, Scott Stringer, Loree Sutton, and Andrew Yang for not only giving us your time, but also for running for this really important office and being willing to give a vision of what we need to do as a city and as a society. So Godspeed, be well, stay safe, and thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you. Really, thank you, everybody.